Eduardo Belmonte, 55, and his wife Isabella, 45, lived a seemingly perfect life. He was the owner of Belmonte Industries, one of the largest construction companies in the state, while she was the picture of sophistication and grace. After 15 years of marriage, they had established themselves as one of the city's most admired couples. One morning, their routine began as usual. Breakfast on the terrace, Eduardo reading financial news, while Isabella organized their social calendar. Maria, their housekeeper, reminded Eduardo to take his heart medication, prescribed after a mild heart attack 6 months ago. He had a board meeting and lunch with the mayor planned, while Isabella would meet with decorators and the charity committee about that evening's gala. At the office, Eduardo's secretary Lucia handed him a manila envelope marked "Personal and Confidential," with no return address. After his board meeting, Eduardo opened it to find shocking contents. Photographs and documents revealing that his wife Isabella was actually someone named Rosa Martinez, a woman from a poor background who had been involved in an embezzlement scandal 12 years ago with a man named Antonio Diaz. According to the records, Rosa Martinez had worked as a bartender and had been a person of interest in the case when Antonio Diaz disappeared with stolen money. But this couldn't be his Isabella. He had met Isabella Vasquez, daughter of a wealthy Spanish businessman, at a gallery opening in New York 15 years ago. They had married after a whirlwind romance, and she had perfectly fulfilled the role of Mrs. Belmonte ever since. A note included with the document stated, "The woman you call Isabella Belmonte is living a lie. Everything she has told you about herself is false. She targeted you for your money and position. Ask her about Rosa Martinez and Antonio Diaz if you want the truth." Eduardo struggled to process this information. Had his entire marriage been based on a lie? Who was the woman he had shared his life with for 15 years? Unable to confront her immediately, he asked Lucia to research the names Rosa Martinez and Antonio Diaz, claiming it was related to a business associate. Later, Lucia reported finding old news articles about Rosa Martinez's involvement in an embezzlement case at Diaz Imports about 12 years ago. The owner, Antonio Diaz, had disappeared with most of the money, but Rosa was never charged due to lack of evidence. That evening, Eduardo and Isabella were scheduled to attend a charity gala. Despite his turmoil, Eduardo decided to go through with it, watching his wife for any signs that might confirm or deny what he had learned. Her text message about his cufflinks from their first anniversary seemed so normal, yet the documents in his desk suggested everything about their life together might be a carefully constructed lie. Eduardo realized he needed to investigate further before confronting Isabella. The woman he had married and built a life with for 15 years might be a complete stranger, and he needed to understand the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Eduardo kept his expression neutral. "What rumors exactly?" Anderson looked uncomfortable. "That Isabella is not who she claims to be, that she has a criminal past under another name." "And who is spreading these rumors?" Eduardo asked, though he had his suspicions. "Anonymous sources," replied Janet Wong, another board member. But the specificity of the information makes it difficult to dismiss. Eduardo surveyed the room, noting who met his gaze and who avoided it. His brother Rafael was watching with barely concealed interest. "Let me be clear," Eduardo said firmly. "My private life is just that, private. It has no bearing on my ability to lead this company, which has seen record profits under my leadership for the past decade." "Normally I would agree," said Robert Miller, a major shareholder. "But when your wife's alleged criminal connections involve the Vega family, it becomes relevant to this company's future." Eduardo felt a chill. How did they know about the Vegas? The only people aware of that connection were Isabella, Victor, and himself. Miller nodded. "We've received information that your wife is being investigated in connection with a 15-year-old embezzlement case involving Antonio Diaz, who had business ties to the Vega family. Is this true?" Eduardo fought to keep his composure. Someone had been feeding the board very specific information that had only recently come to light. "My wife is not under any investigation," he said truthfully. "As for these other allegations, They are private matters that I am handling. They do not affect my ability to run this company. With all due respect, Eduardo, Rafael spoke up for the first time. If the Vegas are involved, it absolutely affects this company. Their reputation alone could scare off investors and partners. Not to mention the downtown development project is now in jeopardy because of your personal issues. The way Rafael emphasized personal issues made Eduardo's suspicions grow stronger. His brother seemed too well informed, too ready with specific concerns. The downtown project is proceeding as planned, Eduardo countered. I spoke with the mayor yesterday, and all approvals are on track. That was before Javier Vega expressed interest in the same property, Rafael replied smoothly. Now the city council is suddenly reconsidering our proposal. If I may, said Helen Rodriguez, one of the newer board members, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. We don't have confirmation of any of these rumors, just anonymous reports. Before we take any drastic action, we should give Eduardo a chance to address these issues privately. Several board members nodded in agreement, giving Eduardo a small sense of relief. He had allies in the room. Thank you, Helen, he said. I assure the board that I am handling these personal matters, and they will not impact the company's operations or reputation. I would ask for your trust and a reasonable amount of time to resolve these issues. How much time? Miller pressed. The shareholders' meeting is in 2 weeks. We can't go into that with these questions hanging over us. 1 week, Eduardo proposed. Give me 1 week to address these concerns. The board members exchanged glances, silently communicating their positions. Finally, Anderson spoke. I move that we defer any decision regarding leadership for 1 week, during which time Eduardo will resolve these personal matters to the board's satisfaction. I second the motion, Helen said quickly. All in favor, Anderson called. 10 hands went up. Only Rafael and Miller abstained. Motion carried, Anderson declared. Eduardo, you have 1 week. For the sake of the company your father built, I hope you can put these matters to rest. After the meeting adjourned, Rafael lingered behind, waiting until they were alone. Well played, brother, he said, his tone impossible to read. But 1 week isn't much time to undo 15 years of lies. Eduardo studied his brother's face. You seem remarkably well informed about my personal situation, Rafael. Care to explain how? Rafael's expression remained neutral. People talk, Eduardo, and when they talk about the CEO of Belmonte Industries being married to a woman with a false identity, I listen. Did you do more than listen? Eduardo asked directly. Did you help spread these rumors to the board? Rafael looked offended. I warned you about the meeting, didn't I? If I wanted to undermine you, I would have let you walk in unprepared. That doesn't answer my question. I didn't start these rumors, Rafael said firmly, but I won't pretend. I'm not concerned about what they mean for the company, for our family legacy. Eduardo wasn't sure he believed his brother, but confronting him further would achieve nothing right now. Then help me protect that legacy. Support me with the board while I deal with this. Clean up your mess, Eduardo, Rafael replied. Then we'll talk about support. He gathered his papers and headed for the door. 1 week isn't much time. I suggest you get started. Once alone, Eduardo sank into his chair, the weight of his situation pressing down on him. The Vegas were threatening his family. Someone was undermining him at the company, and his brother seemed to be playing both sides. And in the midst of it all, his marriage, the one thing he had always thought solid and true, was built on lies. His phone rang, interrupting his dark thoughts. It was Victor. I've got something, the investigator said without preamble. A lead on Antonio Diaz in Argentina. My contact there found records of a man matching his description entering the country under the name Miguel Fuentes 8 months. Roche, that matches with what Vega told us, Eduardo said, feeling a spark of hope. Can your contact find out what he did while he was there? Who he met with? Already working on it, Victor replied. There's something else. The listening device. I found in your study yesterday. It's sophisticated, military grade. Not something an amateur would use. Eduardo froze. You found a listening device? In my home? In your study. I swept the room last night after you and Isabella went to bed. Standard precaution given the circumstances. Who would plant something like that? Eduardo asked, though he was already considering possibilities. Someone professional, Victor replied. Someone with resources. The Vegas have access to that kind of technology, but so do others. Like who? Victor hesitated. Corporate espionage. Isn't uncommon in your industry. And with the downtown project worth millions, you think this is about business, not about Isabella's past? Eduardo asked. I think they might be connected, Victor said carefully. The timing is too perfect to be coincidence. Someone exposes your wife's past just as a major deal is coming together, then the Vegas get involved, and suddenly they're interested in the same property. Eduardo considered this. Someone's using Isabella's secrets to destabilize me, weaken my position on the downtown deal, and then bring in the Vegas to apply more pressure. It's a theory, Victor acknowledged. One worth exploring. Who benefits most if you lose that downtown project or get forced out of the company? The answer was obvious. My brother, Rafael. He's next in line to take over. Has he shown interest in the downtown project specifically? He's opposed it from the beginning, Eduardo recalled. Claimed it was too risky, tied up too much capital. But the board approved it over his objections. Interesting, Victor mused. I'll look into his recent activities, see if there's any connection to the Vegas or to whoever sent those documents. Be careful, Eduardo warned. Rafael has resources of his own, and if he is behind this, he's already proven he's willing to go to extreme lengths. After hanging up, Eduardo sat in thought for several minutes. Could his own brother be orchestrating this campaign against him? Rafael had always lived in Eduardo's shadow, resentful of the favoritism their father had shown the eldest son. He had made no secret of his ambition to lead the company. But to expose Isabella, to potentially put her in danger with the Vegas, would Rafael go that far? Eduardo needed to get home, to talk to Isabella about these new developments. But first, he had one more call to make. Mayor Richards, he said when the call connected. I understand there are some new concerns about the downtown development approval. Eduardo, the mayor replied, sounding uncomfortable. Yes, well, some questions have been raised about potential conflicts of interest. The council wants to review the bidding process again. This wouldn't have anything to do with Javier Vega expressing interest in the property, would it? Eduardo asked directly. A pause. How did you hear about that? It's my business to know these things, Eduardo said. John, we've known each other for 20 years. Has Vega pressured you? The mayor sighed. Not directly, but when someone with his connections shows interest in a project, the council takes notice. Some members are suggesting we reopen the bidding process. Our agreement is legally binding, Eduardo reminded him. The contracts are signed. Contracts can be challenged, the mayor replied. Found to have irregularities. I'm just giving you a friendly warning, Eduardo. Vega is applying pressure in places you can't reach. I see, Eduardo said coldly. And our friendship of 20 years means nothing against that pressure. Don't put me in this position, the mayor pleaded. I have a city to run, a family to think about. The implied threat was clear. The Vegas had gotten to the mayor using fear to make him reconsider the downtown deal. When Eduardo arrived home, he found Isabella in the living room with Victor going through old photographs and news clippings related to Antonio Diaz. How did the board meeting go? Isabella asked, looking up with concern. They've given me 1 week to resolve my personal issues before they reconsider my leadership, Eduardo replied, loosening his tie. Someone has been feeding them very specific information about our situation, Victor frowned. The same someone who planted the listening device, most likely. You found a bug? Isabella asked, alarmed. In the study, Victor confirmed. I've removed it, but we should assume there may be others. From now on, any sensitive conversations should happen outside the house. Eduardo filled them in on his conversation with the mayor, explaining how the Vegas were now threatening the downtown project. This is all my fault, Isabella said quietly. They're destroying your life because of me. Eduardo sat beside her on the couch. This is not your fault. Someone is using your past as a weapon against us, but you didn't ask for any of this. But if I had been honest from the beginning, we can't change the past, Eduardo interrupted. We can only deal with what's happening now. Victor cleared his throat. Speaking of which, I found something interesting in my research. He laid out several printouts on the coffee table. These are property records for a small farm outside Buenos Aires. It was purchased 15 years ago by a corporation called Phoenix Investments, which was dissolved shortly afterward. "What's the connection?" Eduardo asked. "Phoenix Investments was a shell company," Victor explained. "I traced its formation back to a lawyer here in the city who has represented Antonio Diaz in the past." Isabella leaned forward, examining the documents. "You think this farm belongs to Antonio? That he's been hiding there?" "It's possible," Victor said. "If he used the stolen money to buy the property through a shell company, it would be difficult to trace. And a remote farm would be the perfect place to disappear." Eduardo considered this. "Even if he's not there now, there might be evidence, information we could use against the Vegas." "I need to go there," Victor said. "See the property myself. Talk to locals who might know something." "I'll come with you," Eduardo decided. Isabella looked alarmed. "That's too dangerous." "If the Vegas find out, they're already threatening everything I care about," Eduardo replied. "I can't just sit here and wait for them to destroy us. We need to be proactive." "Then I'm coming too," Isabella insisted. Eduardo shook his head. "No, it's safer for you to stay here." "Safer?" Isabella's voice rose. "The Vegas know who I am, where I live. Carmen is dead. There's no safe place for me, Eduardo. And I know more about Antonio than either of you. If there are clues at this farm, I'm more likely to recognize them." Eduardo and Victor exchanged glances. Her argument made sense, even if Eduardo hated the idea of putting her in additional danger. "She has a point," Victor admitted, "and traveling together might actually be safer than splitting up." "Fine," Eduardo conceded, "but we need to be careful. The Vegas have eyes everywhere, and now I'm not even sure we can trust my own brother." "You think Rafael is involved?" Isabella asked, surprised. "He knew too many details about our situation," Eduardo explained, "and he stands to gain the most if I'm forced out of the company. The downtown project that the Vegas are now interested in, Rafael opposed it from the start." Victor nodded thoughtfully. "I'll look into any connections between your brother and the Vegas. In the meantime, we should prepare for Argentina. I can have tickets and arrangements made by tomorrow evening." "So soon?" Isabella asked. "We don't have the luxury of time," Eduardo reminded her. "The Vegas gave us 3 days to provide information, and the board expects results within a week." "What? About the company?" Isabella asked. "You can't just leave with everything happening." Eduardo considered this problem. "I'll tell everyone I'm taking a short personal leave to deal with family matters. Rafael can handle day-to-day operations. Keeping him busy might actually work in our favor." The plan set, Victor left to make the necessary arrangements while Eduardo and Isabella began preparing for their trip. As they packed, an uncomfortable silence hung between them, filled with all the unresolved issues in their relationship. "Will we ever get past this?" Isabella finally asked, folding a blouse with too much concentration. "Will you ever be able to trust me again?" Eduardo paused, considering her question carefully. "I don't know," he answered honestly. 15 years of lies isn't something you just get over. "But," he sighed, "I still love you. That hasn't changed, even with everything that's happened." Tears filled Isabella's eyes. "I never stopped loving you. Even when I was living a lie, my feelings for you were always real." Eduardo wanted to believe her. Part of him did believe her, but the wounds were still too fresh, the betrayal too deep for complete forgiveness. "Let's focus on surviving this. First," he said gently, "on finding Antonio and dealing with the Vegas. Then we can work on us." Isabella nodded, wiping away her tears. "One day at a time, one day at a time," Eduardo agreed. That evening, while Isabella finished packing, Eduardo made one more call to his lawyer, Jonathan Hayes. "I need you to prepare some documents," Eduardo explained, after bringing his old friend up to speed on the situation. "Transfer papers for my personal assets, power of attorney, a new will, just in case something happens to me." "Eduardo, you're scaring me," Jonathan said. "Are you in real danger?" "I hope not," Eduardo replied. "But I need to be prepared for any possibility. The Vegas aren't known for their mercy. What about the company? Should I prepare anything related to your shares?" Eduardo hesitated. "No, not yet. I'm still hoping to resolve this without losing control of Belmonte Industries. And all of this is because your wife isn't who she claimed to be, Jonathan asked, the disbelief evident in his voice. It's complicated, Eduardo said, not wanting to explain the whole situation over the phone. Just prepare the documents and bring them to my house tomorrow morning. We're leaving for Argentina in the evening. After hanging up, Eduardo sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. How had his life unraveled so completely in just a few days? A week ago, he had a perfect marriage, complete control of his company, and a promising deal about to close. Now, everything was in jeopardy. Isabella came into the bedroom, hesitating at the door, as if unsure of her welcome. "I've finished packing," she said softly. Eduardo nodded, too tired for conversation. He still hadn't decided if Isabella would sleep in their bedroom or the guest room tonight. Part of him wanted the comfort of her presence beside him, while another part couldn't bear the intimacy with so much distrust between them. As if reading his thoughts, Isabella said, "I can sleep in the guest room again if you prefer." Eduardo looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in days. Behind the makeup and elegant clothes was a woman he had shared his life with for 15 years. A woman who, despite her lies, had stood by him through his heart attack, through his father's death, through countless business challenges. Whatever her original intentions might have been, she had been a true partner to him for over a decade. "No," he said finally. "Stay, this is your room too." Relief washed over Isabella's face. "Thank you," she said simply. As they prepared for bed, moving around each other in the familiar routine they had established over years, Eduardo felt a strange sense of normalcy despite everything. When they finally lay down, a careful distance between them, he found himself saying, "Tell me about Rosa Martinez." Isabella turned to face him in the darkness. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Eduardo replied. "Who she was, what her life was like before she became Isabella. I've been married to you for 15 years, but I realize now I don't really know you." Isabella was quiet for a long moment, then began speaking softly. Rosa Martinez was born in a small town to parents who worked in factories. Her father drank too much and disappeared when she was 12. Her mother worked herself to death trying to provide for her daughter. As Isabella continued her story, describing Rosa's struggles to escape poverty, her determination to build a better life, and the mistakes she made along the way, Eduardo listened with growing understanding. The woman she described was not the sophisticated, polished Isabella he had married, but he could see traces of Rosa in his wife, the resilience, the adaptability, the fierce protection of what she valued. "When I met Antonio," Isabella continued, "I thought he was my ticket to a better life. He seemed successful, educated. He offered me a job, taught me about business, about how to move in wealthy circles, but then I discovered what his business really was: money laundering for the Vegas, stealing from suppliers. By then it was too late. He controlled everything, where I lived, who I saw, even what I wore." "Why didn't you go to the police?" Eduardo asked. Isabella gave a bitter laugh. "The police? Antonio had them in his pocket. The few who weren't corrupt were too afraid of the Vegas to do anything. I was trapped. Until he disappeared," Eduardo supplied. "Yes," Isabella admitted. "When he vanished, it was like being released from prison. Suddenly I could breathe again, make my own choices. I knew the police suspected me, that the Vegas would come looking eventually. So I did what Antonio had taught me. I created a new identity, used what I'd learned about wealth and sophistication to become someone new. And then you met me," Eduardo said quietly. Isabella's voice softened. "Meeting you wasn't part of any plan, it just happened, and when you showed interest in me, I was flattered, excited. I told myself it would just be a brief affair, that someone like you would never seriously consider someone like me for marriage. But I did. You did," she agreed, "and I fell in love with you, genuinely in love. By the time you proposed, I was terrified of losing you. So I maintained the lie, told myself it was better this way, better for both of us." Eduardo absorbed her words, trying to reconcile this story with the woman he thought he knew. "Do you ever miss her, Rosa?" Isabella considered the question. Sometimes. She was stronger in some ways, more real. Isabella was perfect, but Rosa knew how to fight, how to survive. I think I'm seeing that side of you now, Eduardo observed. Since all this started, you've shown a strength I didn't know you had. I've spent 15 years hiding that part of myself, Isabella admitted. Being the perfect wife, the perfect hostess, never showing fear or anger or uncertainty. Maybe that's one good thing coming from all this, Eduardo suggested. I'm finally meeting the real you. In the darkness, he felt Isabella's hand find his. And now that you're meeting her, what do you think? Eduardo squeezed her hand gently. I think she's worth getting to know. Morning came too quickly. Eduardo met with his lawyer, Jonathan Hayes, in the garden, away from any potential listening devices. These are the documents you requested, Jonathan said, handing over a thick envelope. Power of attorney, new will, transfer of personal assets. Everything's prepared as you asked. Eduardo took the envelope with a solemn nod. Thank you, Jonathan. I hope I won't need any of this, but better safe than sorry, his lawyer finished for him. Eduardo, are you sure about this trip? From what little you've told me, it sounds dangerous. For it is, Eduardo admitted. But staying here might be even more dangerous. The Vegas are closing in from all sides. Back in his study, Eduardo called Rafael to inform him he would be away for a few days. Argentina? Rafael sounded surprised. Now, with everything happening at the company? It's related to our current situation, Eduardo said vaguely. I need you to handle things while I'm gone. The board won't like this, Rafael warned. Taking off in the middle of a crisis doesn't inspire confidence. I'm not asking for the board's permission, Eduardo replied sharply. I'm telling you as a courtesy. Can I count on you to manage things or not? After hanging up, Eduardo sat back in his chair, troubled by the conversation. His relationship with Rafael had always been complicated, a mix of brotherly love and professional rivalry. But now, with so much at stake, he wasn't sure he could trust his own brother. An hour later, they were in the car with Victor, heading to the airport. They had packed lightly, just one small suitcase each, trying to appear as normal tourists rather than people on a desperate mission. I have more information about the farm, Victor said once they were underway. It's about 2 hours outside. Buenos Aires, in a remote area. According to land records, it's been abandoned for years. No one living there, no reported activity. Perfect place to hide money, Eduardo observed. Or evidence. Or to disappear, Isabella added quietly. The international flight was long and tense. Eduardo tried to sleep but found himself constantly scanning the other passengers, wondering if any of them might be working for the Vegas. Beside him, Isabella seemed equally vigilant, her eyes moving restlessly around the cabin. When they landed in Buenos Aires, it was early morning local time. Victor led them to a modest hotel in the center of the city, far from the luxury accommodations Eduardo usually preferred when traveling. Less conspicuous this way, Victor explained as they checked in under false names. After a hasty breakfast, they met Victor in the lobby and headed to the rental car. The drive out of Buenos Aires took them through gradually changing landscapes, from dense urban areas to suburbs, then to open countryside dotted with farms and small villages. We're being followed, Victor said calmly, about an hour into their journey. Black sedan, 2 cars back, it's been with us since we left the city. Eduardo resisted the urge to turn and look. The Vegas? Possibly, Victor replied, or someone else interested in our destination. The remaining drive was tense, with all 3 of them acutely aware of the black sedan maintaining a discreet distance behind them. Finally, Victor turned onto a narrow dirt road that wound through fields of tall grass. The road deteriorated as they continued, becoming little more than a rutted track. Eventually, they crested a small hill and saw their destination, a cluster of weathered buildings surrounding what had once been a main farmhouse. The place had clearly been abandoned for years, with peeling paint, broken windows, and vegetation reclaiming parts of the structures. As if on cue, the black car appeared at the top of the hill behind them, stopping at a distance but making no attempt to hide its presence. They're watching, not approaching, Victor noted. Interesting. They approached the main farmhouse cautiously. The front door was secured with a rusted padlock that Victor made quick work of with tools from his bag. Inside, the house was a time capsule of abandonment, dust-covered furniture, faded curtains, a calendar on the wall from 15 years ago. But now, Eduardo suggested, now that the truth is out, at least to those who matter most. Would you want to know? Isabella considered this, her expression thoughtful. Maybe not immediately. We have more pressing concerns right now, but someday, yes. I'd like to know if he's still out there. What happened to him? Eduardo made a mental note to add this to Victor's investigation tasks. Finding closure about her father might help Isabella fully reconcile the two halves of her identity. Rosa and Isabella, past and present. Their conversation was interrupted by Eduardo's phone ringing again. It was Victor, calling from the Madrid airport. Change of plans, the investigator said without preamble. I'm coming to the villa tonight, not tomorrow. There have been developments. Eduardo straightened, instantly alert. What kind of developments? Multiple, Victor replied cryptically. Too sensitive for phone conversation, even on this line. I'll explain everything when I arrive. Should be there in about 4 hours. After ending the call, Eduardo relayed the information to Isabella. Victor? Sounds concerned. Whatever he's discovered, it's significant enough to change his plans. Good news or bad? Isabella wondered. With Victor, it's usually both, Eduardo replied grimly. He finds answers, but they tend to complicate things further. They spent the remaining hours before Victor's arrival reviewing what they knew, trying to anticipate what new information might emerge. The money trail, Antonio's miraculous survival, the Vegas' real intentions for Belmonte Industries. Any of these threads could have produced new revelations. When Victor finally arrived, driven up the winding road in a taxi, his expression confirmed their concerns. He looked exhausted and grim, his arm still in a sling from the gunshot wound received in Argentina. Thank you for coming all this way, Eduardo said, helping him with his luggage, especially while you're still recovering. Victor waved off the concern. The shoulder's healing well, and what I've discovered couldn't wait. In the library, with doors closed and voices kept low despite the villa's isolation, Victor shared his findings. First, the money, he began, spreading documents on the desk. I've traced portions of it through various offshore accounts, shell companies, property investments. Daniel Vega was thorough in hiding his tracks, but 15 million leaves echoes, no matter how carefully you launder it. And, Eduardo prompted, about half of it ended up here in Spain, Victor revealed. Specifically in property investments along the coast, luxury developments, resort projects. Spain, Isabella repeated, surprised. Why would Daniel invest the money so close to where the Vegas have business interests? Wouldn't that risk discovery? That's what I thought too, Victor agreed, until I discovered who was managing these investments. He slid a photograph across. The desk, a surveillance image of a man in his 60s, well-dressed, entering an office building in Madrid. Eduardo studied the image. I don't recognize him. You wouldn't, Victor replied. His name is Francisco Vega, Javier's younger brother, who supposedly retired from the family business 20 years ago to pursue personal interests in Europe. Another Vega, Eduardo muttered. The family connections keep multiplying. It gets more interesting, Victor continued. Francisco Vega has been managing these investments since they were established 15 years ago. The timing matches exactly. With Daniel's disappearance and the missing money, Isabella frowned, processing this information. Are you suggesting Daniel was working with his uncle, that they planned the theft together? That's my theory, Victor confirmed. Daniel steals the money from Antonio's operation, frames Rosa for both the theft and Antonio's supposed murder, then escapes to Argentina while the money goes to Francisco in Spain. A family operation from the beginning. But why? Eduardo questioned. Why would the Vegas orchestrate such an elaborate scheme against their own business partner? Control, Victor suggested. Antonio was becoming too independent, too powerful. The Vegas needed to rein him in, remind him who was really in charge, but they needed to do it in a way that maintained their clean public image. Control, Victor suggested. Antonio was becoming too independent, too powerful. The Vegas needed to rein him in, remind him who was really in charge, but they needed to do it in a way that maintained their clean public image. So they had Daniel shoot him, but not kill him, Eduardo concluded, then used his recovery period to assert their dominance, turn him into a more compliant partner. Exactly, Victor nodded, and Rosa was the perfect scapegoat, an outsider, someone with no real power or connections who could be blamed for both. The shooting and the missing money. Isabella stood abruptly, pacing the room as she processed this theory. They set me up, all of them, Antonio, Daniel, the Vegas. I was just a convenient pawn in their power struggle. It appears that way, Victor agreed sympathetically. Though I doubt Antonio was in on the initial plan. Being shot wasn't likely part of his agenda. But afterward, when the Vegas helped him recover, they must have convinced him to go along with the fiction of his death and Rosa's guilt. Eduardo watched Isabella with concern. This changes things. If the Vegas orchestrated everything from the beginning, their current interest in you isn't just about finding missing money or tying up loose ends. It's about maintaining their carefully constructed narrative. Which brings me to my second discovery, Victor said grimly. Antonio Diaz left Spain 3 days ago. His current whereabouts are unknown. The news hit like a physical blow. Eduardo stood moving instinctively closer to Isabella. You're saying he's gone rogue, operating independently of Vega? It looks that way, Victor confirmed. My sources in Madrid say there was a heated argument between Antonio and Javier Vega the day before Antonio disappeared. Apparently Vega wanted to honor their agreement with you, leave Isabella alone in exchange for the downtown project. Antonio had other ideas. He's coming for me, Isabella said quietly, her face pale but composed. After all these years, he still can't stand that I escaped him, built a life without him. We don't know that for certain, Eduardo tried to reassure her, though he feared she was right. There's more, Victor continued reluctantly. Your brother Rafael has been asking questions about Antonio, about the Vegas family structure. He seems to be investigating them now, perhaps having doubts about his alliance. That's something at least, Eduardo said, feeling a small spark of hope that his conversation with Rafael might have made an impact. If he's starting to question the Vegas, he might be open to breaking ties with them, or he might be putting himself in danger, Isabella pointed out. If the Vegas suspect he's turning against them, the implication hung heavy in the air. None of them needed to spell out what happened to people who crossed the Vega family. I've tried to reach him, Victor added, discreetly through intermediaries, to warn him to be careful, but he's not responding. Eduardo checked his watch. Nearly midnight in Spain, meaning early evening back home. I'll try calling him again tomorrow. For now, we need to process all of this, decide our next move. Which brings me to my third piece of information, Victor said, reaching into his briefcase. This arrived at my hotel in Madrid today. No sender information, no note. He placed a small package wrapped in brown paper on the desk. Carefully, Eduardo unwrapped it, revealing a USB drive. Could be anything. Possibly malware designed to infect our systems, track our location. I took precautions, Victor assured him. Had it checked by a cybersecurity expert I trust. It's clean, and it contains only one file, a video recording. Have. You watched it? Isabella asked. Victor nodded. You both should see it. But I warn you, it's disturbing. They moved to Eduardo's laptop, inserting the drive. A video file appeared and Victor clicked to play it. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Security camera video from what appeared to be an office. The timestamp showed a date 15 years ago, late at night. The office was empty until a door opened and 2 men entered, arguing heatedly. Even with the poor quality, Isabella recognized them immediately. Antonio and Miguel. Daniel, she whispered. In the video, the argument escalated, with Antonio shoving the younger man, who responded by pulling a gun. There was no sound, but it was clear from their body language that threats were being exchanged. Then, unexpectedly, Antonio seemed to calm, moving behind his desk as if to retrieve something. When his hand reappeared, he too had a gun. What happened next was chaos. Both men fired. Antonio staggered back, clearly hit, but his own shot had found its mark as well. Daniel collapsed to the floor, blood spreading across his shirt. Antonio, despite his wound, moved to Daniel, checking him, then looked directly at the camera with an expression of panic. The video ended abruptly there. This contradicts everything. We thought we knew, Eduardo said after a moment of stunned silence. They shot each other. Then how did Daniel end up in Argentina? How did Antonio survive? And who sent this video? Isabella added, her voice shaking slightly. Who would have access to security footage from 15 years ago? Victor leaned forward. The timing is what interests me most. This arrives just as Antonio disappears from Spain, just as Rafael starts asking questions about the Vegas. It's not coincidence. Someone is trying to help us, Eduardo realized. Someone with access to historical records from Antonio's office. Someone who wants us to know what really happened that night. But why now? Isabella pressed. After 15 years of silence, why would someone suddenly decide to share this evidence? They considered the question, each lost in thought. Finally, Eduardo spoke. The only thing that's changed recently is that Daniel, is truly dead now. Killed at the farmhouse in Argentina. Perhaps someone who was afraid to speak while he was alive feels safer now. Or perhaps someone wants to create conflict between us and the Vegas, Victor suggested cautiously. This video raises more questions than it answers. It could be intended to make us doubt everything, act rashly. Whether it's meant to help or harm, it's valuable information, Eduardo decided. We need to understand what really happened that night, not just who shot whom, but what happened afterward. How Daniel ended up in Argentina with a story about Antonio accusing Rosa, how Antonio survived and came to work with the Vegas, and who's been pulling the strings all along, Isabella added quietly. Victor gathered his documents, organizing them meticulously. I'll continue investigating tomorrow. For now, I suggest we all get some rest. It's been a long day and tomorrow may be even longer. After showing Victor to his room, Eduardo and Isabella retired to the master bedroom, both mentally exhausted but too wired to sleep immediately. What are you thinking? Eduardo asked, watching Isabella brush her hair at the vanity, a nightly ritual she had maintained through all their years together. She met his eyes in the mirror. That nothing is as it seemed. Not Antonio, not Daniel, not the Vegas. For 15 years, I believed. One version of events, that Antonio was dead, killed by Miguel, who had tried to frame me. Now everything's in question, Eduardo finished for her, except one thing. He moved behind her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. Whatever happened that night, you were innocent, a pawn in someone else's game. Isabella covered one of his hands with her own. But I still built my life on a lie, became someone else, married you under false pretenses. Am I really so innocent? You did what you had to do to survive, Eduardo said firmly. And whatever name you used when we met, the woman I fell in love with, that was real, is real. She turned to face him. How can you be so sure, when everything else has been deception and manipulation? Eduardo considered the question seriously. Because in all the lies, in all the constructed identities and false histories, there's been one constant truth, what we feel for each other. I may not have known your real name or background, but I knew your heart. I still do. The simple sincerity of his words brought tears to Isabella's eyes. Despite everything, the danger, the uncertainty, the revelations that kept upending their understanding of the past, they had found their way back to each other. Truth had not destroyed their connection, but strengthened it, burning away pretense to reveal something more genuine beneath. Later, lying in the darkness with Isabella's head on his chest, Eduardo found himself thinking about the video, about the moment when Antonio and Daniel had shot each other. Something about it nagged at him, a detail he couldn't quite place. He made a mental note to watch it again in the morning, to look more carefully at the sequence of events. As he drifted towards sleep, one last thought crossed his mind. Whoever had sent that video knew where to find Victor in Madrid, which meant they were being watched, their movements tracked. The sanctuary of the Spanish villa suddenly felt less secure than it had just hours before. Morning brought clear skies and a sense of purpose. Over breakfast on the terrace, Eduardo, Isabella, and Victor laid out their priorities. First, we need to establish a timeline of what really happened 15 years ago, Eduardo said, buttering a piece of toast. The video shows Antonio and Daniel shooting each other, but we know both survived. Someone helped them separately or together. The Vegas helped Antonio, Isabella reminded him. He admitted as much in Vega's office, but who helped Daniel? And why did he go to Argentina specifically? Victor made notes in his small leather notebook. I'll focus on tracking movements immediately following the shooting. Hospital records, private clinics, anything that might indicate where they received medical treatment. And I want to review that video again, Eduardo added. Something about it bothers me, but I can't put my finger on what. What about Rafael? Isabella asked. And Antonio being missing from Spain. Those seem like more immediate concerns, Eduardo nodded agreement. I'll try reaching Rafael again today. As for Antonio, he hesitated, not wanting to alarm Isabella unnecessarily. Victor, do you have resources in Spain who could provide additional security here? Discreetly. The investigator understood the implied concern. I know someone reliable in Madrid, former military, now private security. He can be here by this afternoon with a small team. Good, Eduardo said. I don't want to take any chances, especially with Antonio's whereabouts unknown. After breakfast, they separated to pursue their respective tasks. Eduardo set up his laptop on the terrace, replaying the video multiple times, studying each frame carefully. Isabella went through Victor's files on the money trail, looking for patterns or connections they might have missed. Victor made calls from his room, activating his network of contacts throughout Spain and South America. It was nearly noon when Eduardo finally identified what had been bothering him about the video. He called the others to the terrace. Watch carefully, he instructed, playing the video again in slow motion. Focus on the moment right after both men fire their weapons. They leaned in, concentrating on the grainy footage. There, Eduardo said, freezing the frame. Antonio is hit, he staggers back. Daniel is on the floor, apparently more seriously wounded. But look at Antonio's expression. He doesn't look surprised, Isabella observed. He looks satisfied. Victor finished. Like the shooting went according to plan. Eduardo nodded grimly. Exactly. And now watch what happens next. He played the video forward slowly. Antonio moved to check on Daniel, but his movements were efficient, almost clinical. He checked the younger man's pulse, then looked directly at the camera with an expression that now, viewed in slow motion, appeared less like panic and more like calculation. He knew the camera was there, Isabella realized. He staged this. But he was shot too, Victor pointed out. Would he really go so far as to take a bullet to make it look convincing? Maybe he didn't expect Daniel to have a gun as well, Eduardo suggested. Maybe he planned to shoot Daniel and make it look like self-defense, but Daniel surprised him. Or maybe the entire thing was choreographed, Victor proposed, both men willing participants in a deception. The wounds real but controlled, shots to areas that would bleed impressively, but not prove fatal with proper medical attention. But why? Isabella asked, the central question that kept returning. What purpose would be served by such an elaborate fake shooting? They considered the possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Had Antonio and Daniel been working together all along? Had they engineered the whole scenario to steal the Vegas money? Or had Antonio been planning to betray Daniel, only to have the plan backfire when Daniel shot him as well? Their speculation was interrupted by Victor's phone ringing. He answered, listened intently for several minutes, then hung up with a troubled expression. That was my contact in Madrid, he reported. Antonio Diaz has been located. He arrived in Malaga yesterday. Eduardo felt a chill. Malaga was less than 3 hours' drive from their villa. He knows we're here, Isabella said, voicing what they were all thinking. Somehow he's tracked us to Spain. We should leave, Eduardo decided immediately. Find another safe house, somewhere he wouldn't expect. Victor shook his head. Running might be exactly what he wants. To flush you out, get you moving in the open where you're more vulnerable. My security team will be here in a few hours. Better to stand firm with protection than to flee and be exposed. Victor's right, Isabella said, surprising Eduardo with her resolve. I'm tired of running from Antonio from the past. If he's coming, let him come. But this time I won't be the frightened girl he remembers. Her determination was both inspiring and concerning to Eduardo. He admired her courage, but feared it might lead her to take unnecessary risks. At least let's be prepared, he insisted. Victor, when will your security team arrive? By 4 this afternoon, the investigator promised. 4 men, all experienced, all armed. And in the meantime, Isabella asked. Eduardo's expression hardened. In the meantime, we're not defenseless. He went to the library and returned with a small case which he opened to reveal a handgun. I keep this here for emergencies, and I'd say this qualifies. The presence of the weapon changed the atmosphere, making the threat seem more immediate, more tangible. They spent the next hours securing the villa as best they could, checking windows and doors, establishing defensive positions, preparing for various scenarios. By mid-afternoon, Eduardo had made another attempt to reach Rafael, again without success. His brother's continued silence was becoming increasingly concerning, especially in light of Victor's report that he had been asking questions about the Vegas. Could they have done something to him? Eduardo wondered aloud as they ate a late lunch. Taken him somewhere, forced him to call off his investigation. It's possible, Victor acknowledged. The Vegas don't tolerate perceived betrayal. If they suspected Rafael was turning against them. I should go back, Eduardo said, decisively. Find Rafael, make sure he's safe. No, Isabella said firmly. That's exactly what they might want, to separate us, make us more vulnerable. Rafael is a grown man, Eduardo. He made his choices, aligned himself with the Vegas willingly. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. Though her words were harsh, Eduardo recognized the truth in them. His protective instinct toward his brother was strong, but Rafael had betrayed him, had actively worked with the Vegas to undermine him. Whatever danger Rafael might be in now was, at least partially, of his own making. We wait for Victor's security. Team, Eduardo decided reluctantly, then reassess our options. The afternoon stretched on tensely, each of them alert to every sound from outside the villa. A bird calling, the wind in the cypress trees, a distant car engine. Every noise could herald Antonio's arrival, or it could be nothing at all, when Victor's phone finally rang at 3:30. They all jumped. The conversation was brief and one-sided, with Victor listening more than speaking. When he hung up, his expression was grim. My security team has been delayed, he reported. A random police check on the road from Madrid. They're being held for questioning about firearms permits, vehicle registration, bureaucratic harassment, clearly orchestrated. Antonio, Eduardo said with certainty. He's making sure we're alone when he arrives. If he arrives, Victor cautioned. This could be psychological warfare, making us anticipate an attack that never comes, keeping us off balance. No, Isabella said quietly. He's coming, I can feel it. The certainty in her voice sent a chill through Eduardo. Whatever connection had existed between Isabella and Antonio 15 years ago, captor and captive, abuser and victim, it had created a kind of terrible intimacy, an understanding that transcended time and distance. Then we're ready for him, Eduardo said, checking the handgun and placing it within easy reach on the coffee table. Together. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the terrace, they maintained their vigil. Victor positioned himself near the front entrance. Eduardo guarded the terrace doors, and Isabella kept watch from an upstairs window with a view of the approach road. The attack, when it finally came, was not from any direction they had anticipated. The first sign was the smell, smoke acrid and thick rising from the villa's east wing. Then came the sound of breaking glass, followed by a whoosh as flames engulfed the curtains in the library. Fire! Eduardo shouted, rushing toward the library, with Victor close behind. They found the room already engulfed, flames climbing the bookshelves and spreading rapidly across the antique carpet. Get the extinguisher, Victor called, attempting to beat back the flames with a throw blanket. Eduardo ran to the kitchen, returning moments later with a fire extinguisher that seemed pitifully inadequate against the inferno the library had become. The villa has no sprinkler system, Eduardo realized as they fought a losing battle against the blaze. It's too old, too historic. This is a diversion, Victor said suddenly, coughing through the smoke. Where's Isabella? The question sent ice through Eduardo's veins. In the chaos of the fire, he had lost track of his wife. She was upstairs watching the road. They abandoned the firefighting efforts and rushed toward the stairs, but their path was blocked by a wall of flame that had spread from the library to the main hallway. The ancient wooden beams of the villa were feeding the fire, turning what might have been a containable blaze into an inferno. "The back stairs!" Eduardo shouted, leading Victor through the kitchen to a narrow servant staircase that led to the upper floor. Smoke filled the passage, making it difficult to see or breathe, but they pressed on, calling Isabella's name. They found the upstairs sitting room where she had been keeping watch empty, the window open to the cooling evening air. On the floor lay Isabella's cell phone, dropped or discarded. "Eduardo," Victor called, pointing to the window. Outside in the fading daylight, two figures could be seen moving across the garden toward a waiting car. A man dragging a struggling woman. "No!" Eduardo cried, rushing to the window. "Isabella!" Whether she heard him or not, Isabella chose that moment to intensify her resistance, breaking free of her captor's grip momentarily before being recaptured. But the brief struggle gave Eduardo a clear view of the man's face. Antonio Diaz, no longer bothering with his disguise of plastic surgery, his expression a mask of possessive fury as he forced Isabella into the waiting vehicle. Eduardo raced back down the servants' stairs, Victor following close behind. The main floor was now a maze of flame and smoke, forcing them to navigate carefully toward the terrace doors. By the time they burst outside, the car was already moving down the driveway, dust billowing behind it. "My car!" Eduardo shouted, running toward where his rental was parked. But as they approached, they saw it had been sabotaged, tires slashed, windshield shattered. "He planned this perfectly," Victor said, frustration evident in his voice. "The fire to create chaos, the sabotage to prevent immediate pursuit." Eduardo stood helpless, watching the taillights of Antonio's car disappear down the winding road. The woman he loved, the woman who had finally shared her complete truth with him, was gone, taken by a man who had abused her, controlled her, and now, after 15 years, had reclaimed her. The villa was burning behind them, the fire spreading rapidly through the ancient structure, consuming centuries of history and art. But Eduardo barely noticed, his entire being focused on a single, devastating reality. Antonio had Isabella, and Eduardo had no idea where he was taking her, or if he would ever see her alive again. Darkness enveloped Isabella as the car sped along winding mountain roads. A blindfold covered her eyes, and her wrists were bound with plastic zip ties that bit into her skin when she struggled. Next to her, Antonio drove in silence, the only sound the occasional crackle of a radio from which he received terse updates in Spanish. "Where are you taking me?" Isabella demanded, fighting to keep her voice steady despite her fear. "Home," Antonio replied, the single word carrying layers of meaning and threat. "The villa is my home," she countered. With Eduardo, Antonio laughed, a cold sound devoid of humor. "That fantasy life you created? The perfect wife in her perfect mansion with her perfect husband? That was never real, Rosa. It was a dream you were going to wake from eventually." "My name is Isabella," she insisted, clinging to the identity she had built over 15 years. "No," Antonio said flatly. "Isabella Vasquez doesn't exist. She never did. You are Rosa Martinez. You always have been, always will be. And you belong to me." The possessiveness in his voice chilled her. This wasn't just about money or revenge. It was about ownership, control, a twisted obsession that had survived 15 years of separation. "Eduardo will find me," Isabella said with more confidence than she felt. "He won't stop looking." "Let him look," Antonio replied indifferently. "Where we're going, he'll never find us. And even if by some miracle he did..." He left the threat unfinished, but its implication was clear. The car continued for what seemed like hours, making numerous turns that Isabella tried and failed to track through her blindfold. Eventually, the smooth highway gave way to rougher terrain, the car bouncing over what felt like an unpaved road. When they finally stopped, Antonio pulled her roughly from the vehicle. Still blindfolded, Isabella was led across uneven ground, then up a short flight of steps. A door creaked open, and the smell hit her. Salt air, old wood, a hint of mildew. A coastal property, she realized, somewhere isolated along Spain's vast shoreline. Only when they were inside did Antonio remove her blindfold. Isabella blinked in the dim light, taking in her surroundings. They were in what appeared to be an old fisherman's house, simple stone walls, weathered wooden beams, sparse furnishings. Through small windows she could see darkness and hear the distant crash of waves. "Romantic, isn't it?" Antonio said mockingly, noting her appraisal of the place. "Just the two of us by the sea, like a second honeymoon." "We were never married," Isabella reminded him coldly. Antonio's expression hardened. "We would have been, if you hadn't betrayed me, if you hadn't left me for dead and run off to create your new life." "You were shooting at your partner," Isabella exclaimed. "I saw the video, Antonio. You and Daniel shot each other that night." A flicker of surprise crossed Antonio's face before he controlled it. "So you've seen it? Interesting. I wondered if that would surface eventually." "Why did you do it?" Isabella pressed, trying to keep him talking while she surreptitiously tested the strength of her bindings. "Was it all a setup? You and Daniel working together to steal the Vegas money?" Antonio regarded her with something like admiration. "Still sharp, Rosa. Always observing, analyzing. It's one of the things I valued about you." He moved to a cabinet and took out a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "Yes, Daniel and I planned it together. The staged shooting, the disappearances, the theft, a perfect plan. Except you shot each other for real," Isabella pointed out. "The necessary authenticity," Antonio explained, pouring wine casually as if they were having a normal conversation. "The wounds had to be genuine for the deception to work, and we trusted each other enough to ensure the shots wouldn't be fatal." "Then, what went wrong? Why did Daniel go to Argentina while you stayed with the Vegas?" Antonio's expression darkened. "Greed, betrayal, the usual human failings. Daniel was supposed to take the money to Argentina, establish our new identities, wait for me to recover and join him. Instead, he decided to keep everything for himself. And the Vegas, how did they fit into this? They weren't supposed to know anything," Antonio said, sipping his wine thoughtfully. "The plan was for them to believe I had been killed by a jealous employee who then vanished with their money. But Javier Vega was more resourceful than I anticipated. He found me barely alive in my office, got me medical help, and made you an offer you couldn't refuse," Isabella guessed. "Your life in exchange for your loyalty." Antonio inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Something like that. Javier proposed a mutually beneficial arrangement. I would work for him exclusively, help him expand his legitimate businesses, and in exchange he would help me track down Daniel and recover the stolen money." "But you never found him." "Not for 15 years, Antonio corrected. "All that time I was searching, following false leads, always one step behind, until recently when Daniel made a mistake. He contacted someone from the old days, someone he thought he could trust. But this person was more loyal to me than to him. And that led you to the farmhouse in Argentina," Isabella concluded. "Where I finally settled my score with Daniel," Antonio confirmed, a cold satisfaction in his voice. "Though I didn't expect to find you there too. That was a stroke of fortune I hadn't anticipated." Isabella's mind raced, connecting pieces of the puzzle. "You killed Daniel at the farmhouse. You, not the Vegas." "Of course it was me," Antonio laughed. "Did you think Javier Vega would dirty his hands with something so personal? No, he sent me to recover his family's money. Killing Daniel was my own agenda." "Then why pretend it was Vega who shot Daniel when we were at the farmhouse? Why the whole charade with the recording?" Antonio's smile was chilling. "Because it served both our purposes. Javier got his money back and eliminated a family embarrassment without direct involvement. I got my revenge on Daniel and found you in the process. A perfect symbiosis. Until you decided to break your agreement with the Vegas and come after me," Isabella noted. "Why risk their anger? Why not leave me alone as promised?" Antonio set down his glass, his expression shifting from casual arrogance to intense focus. "Because you were always the missing piece, Rosa. The one thing I couldn't replace or replicate. 15 years I watched you from a distance, living your perfect life with Eduardo Belmonte. 15 years of waiting, planning, preparing for the moment when I could reclaim what's mine. The obsession in his voice terrified Isabella more than any physical threat. This wasn't a rational adversary who could be reasoned with or bargained with. This was a man consumed by possession, by a pathological need to control what he considered his property. "I was never yours," she said quietly but firmly. "Not 15 years ago, not now." Antonio moved with unexpected speed, crossing the room and gripping her chin painfully, forcing her to look into his eyes. "Everything you are, I created. The languages you speak, the knowledge of art and wine, the social graces that let you move in Eduardo's world. All of it came from me. Without my training, my molding, you would still be a bartender in a dead-end job, dreaming of a better life you could never achieve." Isabella refused to flinch or look away. "You taught me skills, yes, but everything meaningful. The woman Eduardo loves, the life we've built together, that had nothing to do with you. That was me, Antonio, just me." Fury flashed across his face, and for a moment Isabella thought he would strike her. Instead, he released her chin abruptly and stepped back, regaining his composure with visible effort. "We have time to resolve these. For misconceptions," he said, his voice artificially calm. "Plenty of time. No one knows where we are. No one can find this place. It's not in my name, not connected to me in any traceable way. Yet you brought me here," Isabella pointed out. "Why not kill me at the villa? Why go to all this trouble?" Antonio looked almost hurt by the question. "Kill you? Is that what you think I want?" He shook his head slowly. "No, Rosa. I didn't spend 15 years searching just to destroy you. I want us to start over, together, the way it should have been before everything went wrong." The delusion behind his words was perhaps the most frightening thing Isabella had heard yet. Antonio truly believed they could have some kind of future together, that he could erase the past 15 years and resume their relationship as if nothing had changed. "That's not going to happen," she said firmly. "Ever." Antonio's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You'll change your mind. You'll see that this is where you belong with time." "Time won't change anything," Isabella insisted. "I love Eduardo. I will always love Eduardo." "Love?" Antonio spat the word like it tasted bitter. "What do you know about love? You've been living a lie for 15 years, playing a role, the devoted wife, the perfect hostess. That's not love, Rosa. That's an extended performance." "You're wrong," Isabella said simply. "What Eduardo and I have is real, more real than anything I ever had with you." Antonio studied her for a long moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "We'll see. When Edward's dead, we'll see how long your love sustains you." Fear gripped Isabella's heart. "What do you mean? Eduardo wasn't at the villa when you took me. He's safe." "For now," Antonio agreed. "But he'll come looking for you, of course. And when he does," he let the implication hang in the air. "You've set a trap," Isabella realized with growing horror. "You're using me as bait." Antonio's smile was all the confirmation she needed. "Eduardo Belmonte is a predictable man. His devotion to you is his greatest weakness. He'll follow any lead, take any risk if he thinks it might bring him to you. Then you don't know him as well as you think," Isabella countered, trying to hide her fear. "Eduardo is methodical, careful. He won't rush blindly into danger." "Perhaps not," Antonio conceded, "but he also won't abandon you, and eventually, his search will lead him to places where my associates are waiting. One way or another, Eduardo Belmonte will not survive his quest to find you." Isabella fought to maintain her composure, to not reveal how deeply his words had shaken her. "You underestimate him, you always have." Antonio merely shrugged, unconcerned. "We'll see." He checked his watch. "It's late. You should rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day. We have much to discuss about our future together." He led her to a small bedroom with a single window overlooking the dark ocean. The room was sparsely furnished, just a bed, a chair, and a small table with a lamp. "No phone, no computer. Nothing that could be used to communicate with the outside world. I'll remove the zip ties if you promise to behave," Antonio offered, his tone suggesting he was being incredibly generous. "I promise," Isabella said, knowing. Resistance at this point would only make her situation worse. She needed to be patient, to watch for opportunities, to conserve her strength for when it might make a difference. Antonio cut the plastic bindings, then backed toward the door. "Don't try anything foolish, Rosa. The house is isolated, the nearest neighbor miles away, and I'm a very light sleeper." After he closed and locked the door, Isabella examined her prison carefully. The window was small, but might be large enough for her to squeeze through if she could open it. She tested it quietly, finding it painted shut from years of sea air and neglect. The glass was old, thick. Breaking it would make noise that would certainly alert Antonio. The door was solid wood with a simple but sturdy lock. Without tools, there was no way to pick or break it. The walls were stone, the floor wooden planks worn smooth by time and use. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Isabella forced herself to think strategically. Antonio had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated her. He still saw her as the frightened young woman she had been 15 years ago, not the person she had become. That misperception could be her advantage if she used it correctly. She thought of Eduardo, imagining him at the burning villa, discovering her missing. The pain he must be feeling, the fear and determination. Antonio was right about one thing. Eduardo would never stop looking for her, but that meant he would be walking into